Thanks for people watching. Today's Zoom chat is with John Rommel, who was my teacher at Indiana University, starting way back in 1993. Welcome, John. Great to see you.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks. I'm gonna just to
I think,
admit a few people,
yeah.
and
I was thinking it was 94 when you came,
you're
fall of
right. It was
94.
January of
Yeah,
'94.
because it was my second year teaching.
Yeah. No, your first year. Halfway through your first year.
Did you come in halfway?
I yeah. I
Okay.
transferred in the middle of the year.
Oh, see, I was thinking it was the start of the second year, but it was the middle of the first year then. Yeah.
Middle of the first year. So yeah, uh,
Boy, you're old. You're getting old, man.
I know, I know. I saw an ad today for something that affects people 50 and older, and I realized I was 3 years from that. So it's
Oh, yeah, yeah.
it kind of hurt.
I vaguely, I vaguely, I vaguely remember 50. Yeah.
Oh,
It's
I
been a
don't.
while.
I remember your party. Um,
That's right. That's right.
that's right. So well, we'll do another one sometime.
Yeah.
A couple years.
If I make it to
Uh,
70, maybe.
yeah, you'll
It'll
make
be
it.
it'll be a retirement party as well.
Oh, we'll have fun with that, but no time soon, I hope.
Yeah.
So some of these questions will be, of course, for some people that don't know you quite as well, so I thought the first thing I would ask, and like I said, you and I have talked about some of these things before, but I want you to talk about your growing up because both your parents are musicians and kind of how you started and all
Right.
that part of your life.
Sure. Sure. I always joke, and I've told people in master classes that as far as I remember, there's two things that Doc Severinsen and I have in common. One is we both play the trumpet, and I think we both started playing trumpet when we were 7. If I remember something in his bio that he started when he was 7 years old, and that's when I started playing the trumpet. So I was it was after my first grade year, going into second grade. And my father was really an excellent trumpet player, young trumpet player. When he was in high school, it was during World War II, and a lot of the older trumpet players in town, he grew up in the Cincinnati area, were of course going to war. So there were a lot of big bands that played live on radio at Saturday shows and everything else. And they came to his high school band director and said, "Do you have any really good high school trumpet players that could just fit in the section where you need have enough people to fill out a big band?" And he said, "I really don't." But he said, "I've got this 8th grader that's fantastic." Right. And so my dad started, they brought him in and he could play the parts and everything. And he was like maybe, what, 14, 15 years old, maybe. So he started playing in the section, and then he told me, he said, "Yeah, I did that for a while." And then the older guys were joking around town, thought, "Let's give him a lead chart just to see how he does on it." And he just nailed it, put it down. He could do all the stuff. It was, he's a great player. And so he was playing, all the solos. In fact, I was just going through down in this downtime because there are no gigs that we have,
Right.
many of us have, going through old stuff, getting rid of a lot of things from my parents and everything else. And I ran across some old pictures of my dad playing the trumpet when he was about 18 at that point, standing up in front of a big band playing solos. So my dad, got out of music by the time he was 20. Outside, he taught some privately at our home, and he went into business because his thought at that point was, "I don't think there's a way I can really support my family the way I'd like in music." And so he kind of made that decision, which I think he always regretted. And I can honestly say, I remember how he played and some of the stuff he did. And I'm going, I think he would have been just fine. He would
Right.
have done really well as a professional musician. But I grew up listening to him play. And then the recordings that he would listen to back in the old LP days, when we had record players, he had Doc Severinsen recordings, and he had some Al Hurt recordings, and then some Maurice Andre recordings. So I grew up, he had virtually no orchestral things. He did mostly commercial playing. But anyway, I grew up that my father also studied with Frank Simon, who's a great cornet soloist with the John Philip Sousa band. So he studied with him all the way through high school. Interestingly enough, the same time that Al Hurt was studying with Frank Simon. I don't think they ever met, but they were there at the same time. And so I grew up hearing my dad play the trumpet, and I kept bugging him to let me play the trumpet. So he finally, I think my mother, as she told me, after my first grade year, she was getting tired of hearing me beg to play the trumpet. So she said, Jack, just give him a mouthpiece and let him have a mouthpiece to mess around with. And so he gave me an old mouthpiece and said, hey, work on this one. You can start buzzing into some stuff. Then we'll maybe get a trumpet. And I don't remember any of this, of course, but I must have just went around all the time buzzing the mouthpiece. And then he's like, okay, well, we'll let you start playing the trumpet.
Wow.
And at that point, I had no front teeth. I had lost my front teeth. So, I started playing trumpet without any front teeth. I was, 7 years old. My dad was my first teacher and, was really an excellent teacher. And my mom was a amateur clarinetist. She was a really fine clarinetist through high school and college. And she taught a lot of clarinet privately at our house as well. So I grew up with music in the house. My mom also taught recorder lessons at our church when I was growing up. And so since I was a young kid, I think I was about 5 or 6, um, I learned to play recorder first. And, I learned how to read music. And the interesting thing was I could read music before I could read words because
Right.
I hadn't started in school, so I couldn't read language. And so the older students would actually point out the tune we were supposed to be playing because I couldn't read it. And then I just start playing it because I could read music. That's how I learned to do it. So it was a really good musical, family from that standpoint, growing up. I think it was, like I said, my dad was such a terrific trumpet player. I always wondered why. He did mostly commercial. He wasn't a jazz trumpet player, an improviser. He was the old kind of almost like Harry James type of player. Of course, Harry would do some improv, but it was just like embellishing the melodies all over and then playing lead on stuff. I think, I never did that for a long time. And I also never played cornet solos when I was growing up. And I think the reason was, number one, they were really hard, probably, but number two was he would play them and he could play the fire out of them because he'd studied with a cornet soloist. I still have copies of all his old cornet solos in my filing cabinets,
Wow.
from when he was studying with Frank Simon, and he could play all that stuff. And it's like I didn't want to compete with that. There was no way I could come close to what he was doing. And when it was commercially oriented things, I couldn't do either. And I think it's in large part why I gravitated to orchestra so much because that was an area that he was not as familiar with
Right.
and everything else. And so I really gravitated to that. And I came back to wanting to do more commercial playing once I got out of college and started playing professionally, of course. But so that's how I kind of got started, very young age. When I was in 6th grade, my father thought that we were getting to the point where he was very concerned at that point of being a father teaching your son play trumpet. The father-son dynamic as well as teacher-student dynamic. And so he contacted, there was a lady who was an orchestra director in town that was really well known. And she knew the principal trumpet player in the Louisville Orchestra at the time was Leon Rapier. And so she got in touch with him. And he didn't really take that many students, certainly not that young. But she got him to give me private lessons. So I started studying with Leon when I was in 6th grade and studied with him pretty much all the way through high school. There was one year where the university said he was too busy between the orchestra and teaching that he couldn't teach high school students. So I studied with Jerry Amon for like a year, the second trumpet player in the orchestra at the time. And then my senior year, I went back and studied with Leon again.
Wow.
And then, of course, went to school at the University of Louisville. So Leon was a really one of my first strong influences as well. But I started studying with a professional trumpet player when I was in 6th grade. So that's kind of a thumbnail how I got started on things.
Yeah.
I think a lot of my students know that, and I think it's of interest to a lot of people out there because a number of trumpet players go through embouchure changes at some point. Some of them I don't think are probably necessary
Right.
that people do, but I think some really are. And I actually developed into a really strange embouchure by the time I was in high school. And I found when I was going through the records yesterday, I almost brought it in to show it because I thought it'd be pretty funny because I can never remember exactly what it was now. It's been so long. ago. But I've got it. I was playing really, really well, but some people were concerned. My dad was concerned, what would be long term. And, um, I ended up changing my embouchure my senior year of high school. Uh, I'm not sure if my dad might not have let it get out of whack. He might have changed it around.
Yeah.
I think he might have not let it if he was actually teaching me. But so anyway, I had to change that embouchure when my senior year of high school. It's interesting. That was the first time I ever heard the name Arnold Jacobs very much just from a teaching standpoint, because after my sophomore year of high school, my teacher, Jerry Ammon, wanted to change, thought I really needed to change the embouchure. And I took a whole year before I actually started doing it because I just didn't really know. But I was at Interlochen, and I was first chair in the World Youth Symphony that summer, all 8 weeks. There's, auditions, challenges every week. And so after my sophomore year, I was first trumpet the entire time. And I was telling some of the faculty that, my teacher wants me to change my embouchure, and they go, you sound great. You sound really great. What? I don't think so. Yes, it's unconventional. It's a little bit weird. And I remember one person in particular, she was at that point principal horn in the New Orleans Symphony, um, Rebecca Ummel. Um, and I remember her saying, you have to go through Chicago getting back to Louisville on your way back from Interlochen. Um, Promise me you call Arnold Jacobs and you stop and get a lesson with Arnold Jacobs. And if Jake says you should change your embouchure, change it. And if he says don't change it, don't let anyone change it. And I talked to my parents about it, and they were like, "Oh, I don't think that's really necessary." So I never had the lesson with
Oh,
Jacobs. So I don't know what he would have said. But anyway, so I went through that, which is a really difficult experience, especially your senior year of high school. And then you're thinking about going to college, basically starting over again.
now were you with
And
Louis Davidson at that time too?
no, when I started studying with Louis, I changed my embouchure in the summer or the end of my junior year. And then Leon and Jerry both were teaching at Interlochen, so they left for 8 weeks that summer. So just when after I changed my embouchure, was getting it going, um, they left town. So Leon said, why don't you go up and see if Louis Davidson will take you as a student during the summer. And that's what I did. My parents drove me up, and I drove sometimes, but I'm not even sure I had my permanent license initially. Man, I went up basically every week that summer, and then continued, even though I was taking lessons with Leon my senior year. He was fine with it. I came up almost every week and studied at Indiana University with Louis Davidson my whole senior year.
Wow.
And so he was a really, really strong influence on me at that time. We had some unfortunate things that happened afterwards, but and I didn't really stay in touch with him after that, which I still regret. But it was, he was great in so many different ways, playing wise, and he was like my grandfather in a lot of ways. He was, every time I'd see him, he'd give me a big hug,
Yeah.
and things. And, it was a really good time. And, gradually things came around, but it's really interesting. During that whole time that I was changing my embouchure, I remember thinking so much about the chops, what they were supposed to be doing, how they're supposed to be, and how they're supposed to look, and all these different things. And I don't remember ever really focusing on air much at all. I don't remember anybody really talking about it all that much, or, importance of it. And I was so keyed in on getting the chops to work. And I think that's, and I got pretty good at it. By the time I was, 20, I won a job in Nashville, which is a part-time orchestra back then. But it was, a few years after that I got really frustrated. I go, yeah, something's still not right. And that's when I first met Vince Chikowitz, and then started studying with Bill Adam after that. And then I was like, why wasn't I thinking this way all along? And it's because most of the teachers at that point didn't really talk about airflow and how important it is, what it's supposed to be doing when you're playing a brass instrument. There were a lot of, Arnold Jacobs really changed the way people think about air and how a brass instrument works. And I was kind of growing up in high school, kind of the early middle part of that, where he didn't have the worldwide influence that he had later on. And so people didn't really talk about it all that much, you know, and a lot of times they talked about it, you know, supporting from the diaphragm, and people even talking pushing from the diaphragm, all these type of things, you know, and so that was about all I knew about air. I mean, I knew you had to use air to play the instrument, but I had no idea how it was supposed to work. And
Right.
I would say, you know, even though I was playing pretty well, I was frustrated with stuff. It wasn't until I was in my mid 20s that I think I, for the first time, had an inkling of how air was supposed to be used to play a brass instrument and how important it was. And it's like, wow, where have I, you know, where have I been all these years?
Yeah. What kind of things did you work on with your dad or with Rapier? What kind of materials or what were the lessons like? Were you?
Well, you know, I mean, it was a lot of material playing through things. You know, with my dad, I have to honestly say I don't remember lessons all that great because it's, you know, been a long time.
Yeah.
I know we played a lot together. He had me working out of a lot of the old Rubank books, elementary methods and intermediate, going through that. So I remember we worked through that. What I remember most studying with my dad, and probably because this continued a little bit later, because he still continued to play the trumpet on the side, was that we played duets all the time, which was both, you know, fun and depressing, right? Because, you know, I have to admit I did learn to read pretty well because my dad basically would not stop. You know, if I got off and everything else, it was up to me to get back on. You know, and he was nice enough about it, but he wasn't like, you know, he wasn't like had his arm around me. Okay, it'll be okay now. Think of this. It was just like, just do it. Learn how to read. And you know, and he could play the fire out of stuff and sight read great. You know, so that's what I remember the most working with him. When I started studying with Leon, he had a routine that he gave me. I still have it in my files of, and it was just basic. There were some long tones in it. There was some Clark. There was tonguing. It was just the typical stuff that everybody was doing. And
Right.
I remember working on a lot of it and working for evenness and some dexterity and things. Once again, I don't ever remember people us talking that much about sound quality, but I always had a basically good sound quality to start with. So maybe that was, you know, maybe that was the reason they didn't do it. Leon was also, he was a big Sam Krause disciple. Sam was, you know, principal in the Philadelphia Orchestra before Gil Johnson. And he, Krause got into all kind of syllable work. And I
Right.
still have my Clark book has things that I copied from Leon because he was trying them with Sam Krause would send him all these notes. And it was kind of changing syllable on every note as you move around the horn. And what I remember in some of those lessons was, you know, I'd be so focused on trying to figure out what syllable to use, I couldn't play any of the notes. You know, I
Yeah.
couldn't, you know, focus on what I was doing. And so at that point, I was, yeah, I don't think this is really going to work for me. You know, maybe it's a great idea, but it's not working. So I would try it a little bit, but not all that seriously, because something told me that it wasn't really what would work for me.
Right.
And Leon, it worked for him a lot as a player. I think he did a lot of those things and it worked. Um, and most of the rest of the time was we just worked a lot on literature. And even when I worked with Louis, you know, he had me play a lot out of his trumpet techniques book.
Right.
And when I was studying with him, I remember when the Trumpet Profiles book came out because that came out while I was studying with him. Um, and but you know, he had me working on those exercises. And of course, Louis had incredible facility moving around the trumpet. So we were working, I think, more on facility moving around the trumpet. Um, and then we worked a lot on orchestral works and a little bit on solos.
Yeah.
But I would have to say that for even moving around the trumpet a lot of times, what I ended up doing was trying to move around the trumpet, but it wasn't sound oriented. So it actually kind of tightened me up physically and didn't work so well, you
Yeah.
know, because it wasn't sound motivated. And, you know, it wasn't, if you heard Louis play, I mean, I heard Louis play all the things in his trumpet techniques book, and it was just ridiculous, you know, and he was, you know, he talked about, he did this when he played, it just moved, his trumpet moved up and down, or his head moved up and down, right, as he was playing, going up and down. Um, you know, you'd never teach that, but that's kind of what was natural for him. He had studied with Schlossberg, you know, so he had a great teacher, but that was what was natural to him. And his facility was just fantastic of what he could do. Um, like I say, once again, I always struggle with some of the facility. And in some ways, I think it may have been because he probably had a really great airflow, constant airflow going. But what I heard was the facility trying to move around,
Yeah.
and I didn't have the great airflow behind it, so it didn't work all that well for me. And it wasn't until I realistically in my mid 20s, like I say, I got much better as a player. It wasn't until I was in my mid 20s that my first lesson with Miss Chickowitz was the one that totally changed how I thought about playing the trumpet. And then when I started studying with Adam regularly, it was the same thing. It's like I've been thinking about this all wrong for all these years, or at least what's all wrong for me.
So
I always tell students, it's not like what I teach and everything else is the only way you can play the trumpet. I'm going, there are people that think differently. There are people that are much more mechanically focused on what they're doing, what the chops are doing. All these things are happening. What I can say is that never worked for me. I was about ready to give up playing the trumpet. That's how frustrated I was. It never worked for me. So I had to find a different way. And when I did start, you know, met Chickowitz and worked with him and then worked with Bill Adam, I went, hold it, this makes so much more sense. This is a much more natural, easy approach to playing the instrument, which is what I think I did early on when I was playing. Because I was a really good young trumpet player. I think I started out kind of naturally. I don't remember focusing on anything in particular. And I wonder in some ways if what got me into a little bit of the embouchure problem was maybe trying to play too hard of stuff too soon. And maybe I didn't have the fundamentals to really try to do what I was trying to do playing the trumpet. And so I kind of muscled some things out, and then that started changing how the face was working and everything else. But by the time I, changed my embouchure, my mouthpiece was down really low and my bottom lip was rolled out. So it was kind of a straight, so you would look at a student and go, oh, wow, that's pretty strange. And I knew that it was, if I played for a long period of time, things would get kind of really sore and stuff. So I knew that I think deep down, I knew that it wasn't going to work long term. The interesting thing, I think it would have been interesting at that time if I had been studying with Chickowitz or Bill Adam, if I would have actually changed the embouchure or they just would have changed it by the way they had me focused on playing the instrument. Because I remember talking with Chickowitz one time, asking him when I was watching him teach in between lessons, I said something about changing embouchures, and he just kind of smiled. He said, well, I remember doing that a few times early on. He said, it never really worked out all that well. So he said, I kind of figured maybe there's a better way to kind of get things working. And so, he gave up on the idea of just totally wholesale changing how somebody set the mouthpiece up. And he tried to remove all the barriers that they had in their playing, which was mostly proper airflow and sound, the sound you're playing with. And when you started changing that, then the muscles and everything else started adjusting because the excess tension that you had because of how you're using your air and everything else went away. So the face kind of became more normal. And Adam was a master of that too. He would get people changing their embouchure around. My embouchure changed when I studied with him, and he never mentioned a word about embouchure. I talked about it a lot, but he never would say a word about it.
Well, what was the lesson with Chickowitz where you said it changed your idea of how to use the air? Can you describe that lesson a little bit?
Well, I have to admit, the lesson I had, I don't remember that much about what he said about air, other than just it should be kind of loose and free. What I remember vividly from the lesson was I walked in to show him something an aspect of my playing that I struggled with to get his advice and help. And I remember I chose the opening of Tchaikovsky Fourth Symphony, right? So I played through the opening, the fanfare thing. I played through it and I made it through it, but I'm working hard and I'm a little bit tired at the end and everything else. And Chickowitz was just so great in lessons because nothing was ever a big deal. I was like, oh, that's fine. Yeah, John, that sounds really, really good. He said, I'll tell you what. He said, why don't we work on the second trumpet part? And I remember in my mind going, I can play the second trumpet part without any problem. I don't have to do that. But of course, so of course I did it. And he said, okay, it sounds really good. He said, now loosen it up. Just loosen it. Let it be freer. Let it be freer. Just play really easily. Nice, full, easy sound. And we worked, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes or so. I don't remember exactly, about 10 minutes on the second trumpet part. And it's like my sound just went like this, opened up, everything got easier, it was more fluid. He goes, wow, that sounds great, John. He said, now go back and play the first part exactly the same way. And I just took an easy breath and played through the whole passage, nailed it, just as strong as I've ever played it, and felt like I hadn't done anything at the end. And I remember getting to the end of it and just being shocked. And then when I watched Chickwitz, I saw him do this in lessons any number of times with students later on when I was observing his teaching. Um, I was like shocked when I put the horn down. I looked over and he was just kind of giggling. He was just kind of laughing a little bit because, he realized that he had just got me playing the horn differently. And he goes, you played the same way up. You don't do anything differently. Now, was it exactly the same? Well, of course not. But was it very different? No. Right?
Right.
It almost felt like it was played exactly the same way. And there were some, slight differences, of course, but I wasn't thinking about anything. I wasn't thinking about what I should be doing chop wise to make it through that and play with the sound I wanted. I just literally like, oh, I played the second part. No, I'm going to play the first part the same way. And it came out. And I remember that vividly. And then we went on in the lesson. He used to use some of the Padeg preparatory melodies. And I remember playing a few of those with him,
Hmm.
because he and Bill Adam were very similar that way. It's like, let's use some of the easier exercise etudes to play to really get it nice and free and singing. So there's, a great sense of freedom when you're playing, play with a great sound, and it was literally the thought that if you can't do it on these easy things, how do you expect to do it on difficult things?
Right.
And so that's when, and of course, Bill Adam used the Getchell study so much. And, Chickwitz, I think, also used the Clodomir Petit exercises, which are great. One of the things I've done this weird summer where I think I've played one gig since March, the end of March, right? Because everything's obviously shut down. So I took a bunch of my books home, and I started playing through a lot of those easy little etudes again. And I tell my students to do it all the time, and I know they don't. You know, I make them do it sometimes in lessons, and I go, "Wow, it's really funny. I'm going to play those easy etudes that I played off and on for years, and they're harder to make sound great than I think they would be." And so I start going, "Hold it a second. It's the same thing for me. If I'm not able to make these sound great with a sense of freedom and ease in my playing than I want, why am I tackling harder things, right?" And so I've spent a lot of time just playing through these simple things, and it's kind of been a refresher course 35 years later or something, of oh yeah, this is making me kind of realize again how important that concept is that you're playing. It goes a little bit too. I remember I asked Chickwitz one time in a lesson, or when I was observing lessons, I said, Mr. Chickwitz, what do you do when you have a student that comes in and is like a really good student and just wants to play really difficult literature, and they can kind of do it, right? But they're not really doing it the way they should be. And he smiled, and his first comment was, well, John, he said, I've been teaching a long time. And he said, most of the students that come here, that come to study with me, know how I teach and know that they're not going to do that. So he said, I don't have to deal with that as much as a lot of people do. Because he said he didn't work on the tremendously difficult literature with people. And he said, it was the whole point of, play the simple things great and then move forward and play moderate things so they really sound great, really beautiful. It doesn't make sense to try to play really difficult stuff and somehow make it sound great when you can't play easy stuff and make it sound great. I think that's how people get in a lot of playing problems, because they try to play literature that's too difficult for them. I think he told me a story. He said, I've been teaching for so many years. I have so many former students out there teaching. And he said, quite often they'll send me programs of what their students are playing on their recitals, just to let them, know what they're doing. He said, frankly, I look at those programs and go, I don't see how they could possibly be playing these pieces well. said their teachers couldn't have when they were in school.
Right.
You know, and I mean, you know, the general level of playing probably has progressed over time, as all things do. But you know, I think he's still saying there's no way that you could actually, when you're at this age, unless you're just an incredible player, that you could actually play these the way you should be playing the trumpet correctly. You know, and I have to admit that's always still one of the challenges for me. You know, and I've had any number of times where I've had really talented students over the years that I've looked back and gone, I shouldn't have let them play that piece. I shouldn't have let them work on that piece. You know, and you know, and it's one of those things you want to challenge a student and you want to see if they can bring the skills that they have on easier things up to a more difficult piece. But you always have to, you know, I need to be better sometimes at stepping back and say, okay, let's put this on the back burner for a while. Let's do this instead. And because I think what we end up doing, you know, progress has to be a gradual thing. And if all of a sudden you try to go from here to here, there's a big void between those two. You know, so if you try to make that leap, you may very well fall in the void. Or what a lot of people do is they're close. It's not a huge void. And then because they're working on something difficult, then they do whatever they need to do just to kind of get it to work. And they say, okay, I got that piece. And I go, yeah, but you're not playing it the way you should be. Right. And once again, I think that's where a lot of times
There's
people
Rommel
get into
already.
playing issues.
Oh, hold on. Let me mute somebody here.
Oh,
There's something very
I,
There we go. I got you
I
back.
just saw a very pretty face there. I remember that. I recognize that face. It was Carol, not yours.
Yeah, not mine. Not mine. Definitely not
yours.
my face.
No.
But no, back to your other point. Yeah, I think I've heard you say that to me once or twice.
Uh-huh. Well, you know, I have to say that, you know, looking back, I've been teaching at IU now for 27 years, which is hard to believe. Um, and you know, right now, my undergraduates, freshmen through seniors, I have 5 new freshmen coming in this fall. Um, and my freshmen through seniors, I'll have 16 undergraduates this year. And I only have 4 graduate students because the level of my undergraduates that have been coming in auditioning for us has been the best that I can ever remember. There were a lot of great players when you were in school and everything else as well, young players, but I've been amazed at how strong some of the undergrads players are right now. They're, you know, really, 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 really terrific players. But one of the challenges I've got is to not let them get ahead of themselves, you know, so that they're always playing things the way they should be playing and not be in a rush. You know, I would say that's the biggest challenge with some of the very best young players that I have right now is they're trying to win a professional audition or they got to be at that level. And the problem is, you know, where YouTube and everything else is great, you know, to hear a lot of fantastic players and sometimes some really great, fantastic young players, you know, people don't develop at the same speed. So if they hear somebody that's their age, that's like, oh, they're so great, I've got to be at that level or I'm horrible. All right. Then, you know, that's when they start getting themselves in the playing trouble because they overplay and overwork because they're not playing correctly and they're trying to skip those steps along the way.
Do you ever find that students on YouTube, because they're looking at things on YouTube and there's so much information out there, do you ever find now that you have to pull people back and say, that might work, that might not work, but I want you to stay on this path and you have to kind of deflect a little bit?
You mean a concepts of
Yeah.
approaching the
Right.
instrument?
Yeah.
You know, what I tell them is there's a lot of garbage out there. There's a lot of really good information out there. There are a lot of great players out there talking. A lot of them friends of mine that I've seen in some of the teaching that I go, boy, that's not the way I would teach somebody to play the trumpet, but it works for them and it works for a lot of students they're teaching. And I'm going, well, when they're great players and they're great teachers out there and they've had success, then listen to what they say because it may make sense to you and help you, right? It may help you figure out how to play the trumpet better. So what I think that one of the biggest problems is there are a lot of people out there that nobody really knows except on YouTube or something else because they have a big presence on the web that aren't great teachers and aren't great players, and they're telling people how, you know, this should buzz and all these type of things, these weird things that they've got people doing contortions of how the secret to playing high on the trumpet or playing this on the trumpet. That's, I always tell people, don't listen to any of that. But if it's somebody that's established as a great player, as a great teacher, then they may be explaining something. And this is what I think is true of a lot of the great teachers over the years. I try to get across to students is that the really great teachers that I've worked with and that I've observed teaching, I think there are more similarities than there are differences in how they play. Just like great players, there's more similarities than there are differences. And so I think a lot of times what we need to focus on are the similarities, not the differences. But the way someone describes or explains something may make sense. I've had a number of students that have gone and studied with somebody else, because I always tell my students, go get lessons with other people. And they'll come back and they'll go, this person was saying almost exactly the same thing that you said, but they said it a little differently and something clicked.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm going, and they go, okay, great. And like I say, there are different ways to think of it. Some people are more focused on mechanics, and they can focus on the mechanics without getting in their way. What I found for myself is when I focus on the mechanics, it always gets in my way and makes me play worse, right? And I found that I think that's probably true for most players. The more you're thinking about what all this apparatus is supposed to do, and it's just too complicated. As Bill Adams used to say, you can only fully focus on one thing at a time. And if you're not focused on sound, your head's in the wrong place, right? So I think it's, that's where I became so much more sound oriented. And, I talked a lot about airflow and stuff like that. Well, I've used this quote for a number of times on the old Summit Brass Arnold Jacobs CDs, one of the lectures where he's talking and he says, I don't care if somebody plays all wrong if it sounds great. And I remember, listening to that and going, that's weird coming out of Jacobs' mouth. But I would have wanted a follow-up question and go, Mr. Jacobs, is it actually possible to be playing all wrong if it sounds great?
Right.
Because I think that may have been what he was getting at, and when it's a great sound, when you're playing with a great sound and you're moving all over the horn that way, you're probably playing correctly for you. And somebody might say, well, that's not exactly right. This doesn't look exactly right. And you go, yeah, but how's it sound? If it sounds great, then that may be what's natural for them. And not everybody's exactly the same. So to try to make everything work the same for everybody, I think is sometimes where we really get in trouble. And the more we're focusing, I have to admit, I know enough about how the chops work, when I'm playing my best, how things feel and all that works. And when things are off a little bit, the more I focus on trying to correct those things that I know need to be corrected in order to play great, it gets a little bit better. And then I hit a wall and I can't get any better. And then finally I go, hold a second. All that stuff is true, but I'm not focusing on the sound. And so then I just start focusing on playing with a great sound and moving around the horn, and everything comes back. And all of a sudden, oh yeah, everything feels great now. And this is, a lot of my students, obviously other people have heard this too, but I don't get it. I don't get the questions as much now as I did when you were in school, because like Bill Adam is, he passed away a number of years ago and hadn't really been teaching actively, for a generation. Yeah. So most of the students only know Bill Adam from what they've heard from me or from other Adam students. But I used to get questions like, well, how did Adam change the way you play the trumpet?
Right.
And I go, yeah, once again, I used to talk about chops all the time. He never would, about what things to do. And, I remember him saying one time, he said, John, I can't see what's going on behind your mouthpiece. So I can't tell you if you feel this happening, if it is, but he said, if you think it's happening, it probably will. And if you're focusing on it, you'll probably do too much of whatever you're doing. So don't think about that. He said, I don't even remember him talking that much about air. He was great, but all he said was take a nice full breath in, return it the same way, keep that breath loose and free all the time, all over the trumpet. And, I had a copy of his routine from high school. And I remember playing through it a few times and it never did anything for me. And then when I came to study with him, I brought that copy with me. and set on the stand because I couldn't play it from memory
Yeah.
and didn't know if he'd have a copy. And I also knew that's what we would do. And we started playing it. And after, 10, 15 minutes, I went, man, I'd never thought of playing it this way because it was not about getting the right notes. It was also about sound, getting great sound and just that easy release and playing, and it was not thinking about mechanics at all. And I go, I've never played these exercises thinking that way. So then as I've studied with him longer, what I remember most from lessons, and once again, I never worked a ton on literature with Adam. I don't think he did with a lot of students, but we'd be playing, routine and some, music as well. But he would stop me and say, John, did you hear the sound change? And I go, yeah, and I did notice it. Most of the time I would hear it, but it wasn't like a huge change necessarily. And he said, okay, well, go back and keep that sound exactly the same as you're moving around. And so I'd go back and I'd focus more on the sound and everything would just kind of work out really, really well.
Yeah.
Right. And so it was basically all sound oriented. It was very little mechanics in it at all. And yet I know he had a really great understanding of the mechanics of how the brass instrument works and how the body worked, but it was one of those things that, it's not necessary in learning to play the trumpet to know all those things, right? What's necessary is to have a great concept of sound, right? And focus on that in order to develop the skills. And that's, once again, all the people that know me, I tell this to all the students, my first lesson with Bill Adam, within 5 minutes, I walked in and said, Mr. Adam, I know exactly how I want the sound. I need to play the trumpet better so I can actually play that way. And he looked at me, he said, John, you've got it backwards. He said, if you know exactly how you want it to sound, that's what you should be focusing on. And then your body will develop the skills to support that sound as you start moving around the instrument. And I have to admit, no one had ever said that to me before. And it was like, what? Because I was trying to figure out the mechanics to play the trumpet so I could play great. And he's like, no, you got it wrong. If you know what playing great is, what you want, that's what you focus on, and everything else will come around. Now, that doesn't mean we don't sometimes have to remember the simple concepts of what the body needs to do, especially with airflow, to help support that sound. But, I also have told students when I first started studying with Bill Adam, his concept was, playing the trumpet is 90% sound, 9% air, and 1% everything else. And I was over at his house, I don't know, a few years before he passed away, talking to him. He said, well, John, he said, playing the trumpet is 99% sound, 0.9% air, and 0.1% everything else. I go, wow, he just upped the ante. It's like, and I'm going, in a perfect world, that's where we would be. And realistically, I think where most students are is they shouldn't be thinking about what's happening in their face. It'll go where it needs to go to support the sounds you want to play with. If they're thinking about anything, they should be thinking about keeping the air loose and free as they move around so they don't start pushing and forcing the air or letting it up. You want to just keep that easy airflow meeting the instrument the whole time. And, they may need to think 80-20 and maybe 70-30. Right. But what I find a lot of times is people are focusing 90% on mechanics and 10% on sound. And I'm going, well, I hope you've got your concept of all the mechanics spot on, because if you don't, you're never going to play with a great sound.
Now, because I've heard you use the line before that, what is it, the best players play with a very specific idea of how they want to sound and a general idea of how they do it. And most players,
Oh, yeah.
right? Say that.
Yeah. Well, I think,
get it wrong.
yeah. I mean, it's just the concept of what we always want to do is we want to have an exact concept of the sound we want to play with. And we have a general concept of how we produce that sound. But what people do a lot of times is they get a very specific concept of how they think they should be playing, and it's a more general concept of what it's supposed to sound like. It gets kind of put way on the back burner. Yeah. So you got to have that specific sound. This is what I'm going for. This is what I'm listening for. And, I've told students this before too. I remember a very talented freshman when I was watching Chikowitz teach. And I met him like 15 years later. it was really funny. I saw him again. I go, I sat in on your lesson because I remember his name. And he remembered that I sat in on it. And I'll never forget because towards the end of the lesson, Chickowitz never had a ton for him to work on, but he'd done everything. It worked really, really well. And at the end of the lesson, he said, it seems like there's something on your mind. Is there something you want to ask me or talk about? And he said, well, Mr. Chickowitz, he said, I've been doing the flow studies. I've been doing all the etudes, all the things that we're talking about. And he said, it's working great. I really love it. It's fantastic. He said, but I just feel like I should be doing more. I need to be doing more stuff. And, he's getting more and more animated. And, he's looking at what else should I be working on? What else should I be working on? And this is one of the things that Chickowitz was the master at. And it's not my personality. I guess it's more in his personality because he never would react quickly to anything like that. He was just this calm guy sitting there. And so the student finally stopped speaking and Mr. Chickowitz said, well, he said, I think if you've done everything that we've been working on, what I would recommend you do is go to the music library and listen to great musicians. And I mean, I thought this, I could hear the kid's jaw hit the floor because it was the last thing he wanted to hear. But what Chickowitz is saying, you need to get a better concept of sound, better concept of music. And he wasn't talking about go listen to trumpet players. He's talking about hear great musicians so that you develop the concept of sound, you develop your concept of music so that then when you go to play trumpet, that's a part of what your goal is. That's what you felt formed a great musical sound and musical phrase in what you're doing.
So what were you listening to? I mean, you mentioned the records of your father when you were young, but what were you listening to when you started to develop more towards an orchestral player at an earlier age?
Yeah, I always, you have to remember it was a totally different time than now. We only had the old big LPs, right? Records. There was nothing online because there were no computers, right? You had to go to a record store. And I grew up in Louisville, and there were a handful of record stores, and they had like a big pop rock section, a fairly small jazz section, and generally a really small classical section. Right? If you lived in Chicago, and was it Rose's Music, I think it was.
Yeah, Rose Records, right?
Huge, right? Rose Records, yeah. Then you could find a lot, but you would go in, and sometimes you would order them. But I, for whatever reason, probably because Leon recommended, he loved Adolph Herseth's playing. He's like, go listen to Bud Herseth. And as soon as I heard him, it was like, that's spectacular. That's just fantastic playing. So when I was growing up in high school, and I don't recommend this to students, by the way, and there's no reason to do it anymore now, but the only time I really listened to orchestras other than Chicago Symphony all the way through high school and college was if I couldn't find a recording by Chicago of the piece I wanted to play. So, I had other recordings, but it was just because Chicago hadn't recorded it or I couldn't get my hands on it. So that was a huge concept for me, was listening to Adolph Herseth's sound. The problem is you don't really know how he sounds from recordings. You have to be in the room with him to know what he sounds in the room. But, so I grew up listening to that sound, and that's what I was listening for. The other sounds, I mean, for me, there were three people I listened to when I was growing up. It was Maurice Andre, Doc Severinsen, and Bud Herseth. And they actually are all similar players in a lot of ways. They're just, the way they play the trumpet, they're just different genres. They go into different areas of playing. So, the thing, and I've told people too, that when I was talking about, you don't know how somebody sounds from recordings. I had one lesson with Adolph Herseth when I was 21 years old. And I remember the lesson vividly, for a number of different things. I've told students, you're 21 years old, you get a lesson with Adolph Herseth. So that was like 1979, so that was like the Glory Schulte years, all that stuff. So what do I do to go into play for Bud Herseth? I go to play Mahler 5 for him. I'm going, okay, big surprise. I'm sure he's like, oh God, another student coming to play Mahler 5 for him. But, that was a signature Herseth thing. And so I played through it and, played it pretty well, I think. And, he was very nice. And then he said, well, let me play it for you. And I remember being stunned because it was in the old orchestra hall. It was down in the instrument storage room, dirty, musty, jammed with everything there, and not the nice facilities they have now. And uh, he's sitting maybe 8 feet away from me. I'm like sitting here, and he's kind of like catty cornered. His bell's pointing that direction a little bit, so he's not directly at me. And he took a breath and started playing. And there were a couple things that I remember vividly. Three things actually. He started playing, and I had never heard such a wall of sound on every note. Every note was just solid, start to finish, all the way through. He gets up high. It's intense, huge sound, but it's just a solid core and wall of sound, every single note. I had never heard anybody play like that up close. And it kind of blew me away. The other thing was he got to the ending, and he turned around and started talking just in a normal speaking voice. I was used to making, I get to the end of Mahler 5, get to the end and kind of let out that extra tension and stuff like that. There was no excess tension. He's like blowing the walls down, this incredible sound, gets to the end, puts his horn down, and just starts talking in normal voice. And I was like, how do you do that? I didn't understand it at all. It didn't make sense. The other thing that maybe it was my imagination, but I don't think it was when he turned around and started talking to me, there was like a glistening in his eyes. And it was like, not like tears, but you could sense that really meant something to him. So those three things I didn't understand until I was about 6, 7 years later, after I had met Chickwitz and Bill Adam, that I realized that, wow, you play with a great sound, start to finish on every note, no let up in that sound. That's exactly what you're going for. I was like, oh, okay. It wasn't that I didn't want to do that. I didn't know how to do it.
Right.
The other thing, you play this long blow thing, and it's not like you run a mile or, run a marathon. It's not like you're out of breath. It's no big deal. You just put it down. You shouldn't be working that hard. And
Right.
the third was music should mean something to you.
Yeah.
I mean, how many times did Adolf Hirsch perform Mahler 5, number one? How many times did he play it in a lesson for stupid students like me that walk in to play Mahler 5, like I'm going to impress Bud Herseth with my Mahler 5, And, how many did? And it's like, it meant something to him.
Right.
Right. And, I think that was really powerful for me because, when I heard that sound up front, it was like that, that told me so much about his playing because it didn't sound the same as what I was used to hearing on the recordings. Right. There were some similarities on it, but I was used to hearing, and even when the old orchestra hall days, hearing him live, the sound sometimes would blossom. It was just like this. And I'm going, well, a lot of that was the hall. And it's where they recorded too. I was at the old Medina Temple, right? And so he would hit that great chorus sound, and then the hall, it would just do this. Right. Yeah. And it was just spectacular, spectacular sound. But it helped really give me that concept of it. But when I talk, I never heard Maurice Andre play live, but I heard Doc Severinsen play a lot live when I was young, and it was the same thing. I remember sitting in rehearsals, in the audience for a rehearsal, maybe 30 feet from his bell. And my God, it was just this concentrated, high energy. The sound was like this and straight up and down all over the horn. Unbelievable, how he played the trumpet. And I'm going, it actually was very similar to the way Bud played. They were just doing different things.
Right.
Different styles, So anyway, those were the formative people for me, growing up. Now there are so many great players out there to listen to. There's incredible players to listen to. So there's a lot of different qualities. There are a lot of different sounds, a lot of different concepts. But those are the ones, I think the thing that I loved about Bud's playing more than anything else was there was a beauty to it. When it was supposed to be beautiful, he'd play it beautifully. But I think the thing that always just attracted me so much was the intensity and the power of, I would tell people that I think I was, it might have been, it was after that lesson, that was before that lesson was the first time I heard the Chicago Symphony play. And I remember going to the concert and thinking, worried about being disappointed, right? Because I had heard all these recordings of Bud and he was this idol in some ways. I'm going, I hope I don't show up at the hall and I'm disappointed how he sounds, right? And from the very start, the whole orchestra and then him coming in, it was better than I had ever imagined, right? Because he could just reach out in the audience and grab you with his sound and the excitement and the energy of the sound. And I think that's what caught me more than anything else. I mean, I know trumpet players like to play loud and high. It wasn't necessarily a high thing. It was that tensity, just the sheer power and emotion in his playing that really struck me, and still does.
Yeah.
Still does. Probably more so than anybody I can think of.
And were there non-trumpet players that you can think of that, sort of the Chickowitz's answer to that student that you would think of in that way?
Uh, I have to. I shouldn't. My students this will come back to haunt me. I have to
I can
admit,
always delete
probably, yeah. I have
this.
to admit, when I was in high school, college, I don't think I listened to that much other music that didn't have brass,
Yeah.
a lot of brass in it. So I think it was much later, that singers started to attract me a little bit more. And I think I would say even before singers, I got into, I enjoyed listening to pianists and violinists a lot. Right. I think they started to attract me, just what they could do musically with things. But that took a while coming. And I think, people didn't talk about listening to other musicians nearly as much. I think people do hear that a little bit more than they used to.
Right.
But I think it's really important because I've told students, and I'm not going to say give a number, but I can count the number of great trumpet players who are great musicians without using all my fingers and toes. Right? There are a lot of great trumpet players out there, and I don't think there are a lot of great trumpet players who are great musicians. Great musicians have tended to gravitate to other instruments for some real obvious reasons. Right? I think partially because of the literature that was written for them. Great composers. I mean, how many great composers wrote music solos for trumpet? Right? So the literature is so much more incredible, and the history is so much more incredible behind it. But I think there are some really great players and great musicians who are trumpet players. Don't get me wrong, but it's a small number compared with all the other instruments and other singers out there. I didn't really enjoy listening to opera when I was in college. And yet later on, I started listening to opera a lot, right? Because the voices really started to attract me, the colors, all the things that they could do, the music started to attract me a lot more. I think some of it's just as you get older, you tend to grow up a little bit and start to expand your horizons, hopefully, of what you're doing. And so a lot of those musicians, really, I remember he's on the faculty now here. I should mention at one time, I think I was 21 years old playing in Nashville Symphony, and Andre Watts played Rachmaninoff second with the orchestra. And of course, I mean, it was just spectacular. But what I really remember was the second movement, the slow passage, because I could actually see him where I was sitting in the orchestra. I could see his face and I could see him at the keyboard. And the lyricism in his playing in that movement was just stunning. I remember just being mesmerized listening to the music that came out of his playing.
Yeah.
Right? I have to admit, there aren't that many times I listen to a trumpet player and I'm mesmerized by the music that's coming out of the trumpet. And it was just incredible color that he had. So, all those things should really affect us as musicians. I think, obviously we gravitate to the people who play our own instrument, and that does help us develop our own sound concept on the instrument itself.
Right. I remember, I don't know if I told you this. I remember being in school and David Robbie is now a conductor, and I went to a coffee concert of Chicago,
Mhm.
and they played uh, Firebird, Unanswered Question, and Brahms One, right? And so we're listening to Unanswered Question, and there were these two older ladies behind Dave and I, and so her set played the first solo. It was, and then he played the next solo, and the woman said he just played that, and she repeated that every
It's
time.
every time.
And then she tapped us on the shoulder and said, he only played the one thing. And Dave said, well, he did change one note each time.
That's right.
but,
That's funny. Yeah.
but it was just like, oh, she's going to say it again, isn't she? So,
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Well,
but
you realize there's a lot of different reasons why people go to concerts, right? And
yeah,
what they're listening for. People listen on a lot of different levels. And I don't think any one level is better than another. I think it's
right.
like you get the enjoyment, whatever it means to you. And for her, it was like, why does he keep playing the same thing?
She was
That's
kind of a
one way to say
Howard
it.
Cosell of an
Yeah.
audience member
Yeah.
right behind me. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Hey, she bought a ticket and showed up.
that's, that's important, especially now. It's very
Right.
important.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, you're talking about students. What would you say you've seen as far as like trends since you started? Are there any differences in students, say, between in the '90s versus now, or
Yeah, I
are things
think there
similar?
really are. They're the biggest difference I would say is, how should I put this? I think the most of the students that I have now, the really young, talented students, are way too hard on themselves and don't have enough fun. And I think, I talked with a few years ago with Lissa May, who's Associate Dean for Instruction now at the school, but a music ed and former trumpet player, or I mean, she still plays trumpets on, but I remember talking to her one time because I started having more and more students having real problems, real issues, not trumpet related
Right.
issues, but more personal life issues and things. And I think, for whatever reason, it's like people seem to be under a lot more pressure now than they were. And I notice it a lot more in the students. They put a lot more pressure on themselves. It's like, you know, and the way she put it, which I think is very accurate, is in a society now, it's like you're not allowed to fail. No one's supposed to fail, right? And I think what was it? It was, I don't know if it was Ben Hogan or I can't remember. It was one of the great old golfers, that talked about, he was quoted, said, "We learn from our failures. That's how we learn." And what I find, when you guys were in school, there were sometimes I thought these guys are just partying a little bit too much. They're not maybe taking things seriously enough. I mean, some of the stuff that was shenanigans going on and the
Not
good times.
me,
Not
but
you, of course, no. But some of the stuff, I'm going, and yet, I think so many of those people are really, really successful. And I'm going, I don't think that it wasn't, people weren't taking it seriously, but it was like it wasn't all consuming and they weren't so worried about screwing up and making mistakes and failing. And, it's interesting. One of the things I noticed, the last 6 weeks of the spring semester where we were doing everything online, it was, nobody really wants to be doing that. And we were talking earlier, it's like you can't hear what they're doing. That's why I had students record stuff instead of being the night before so I could listen to them and then actually give them good advice. And uh, it was not a good situation for most people. There were some people I could actually hear what they were doing pretty well when they were playing. But um, the thing that I noticed was probably, I would say at least 30-40% of the studio, I think they made more progress in the last 6 weeks online than they would have if they were live in the studio, live in school. And I actually mentioned to a few of them, and they kind of agreed, right? And when I talked to them about it, the thing that um, they would say was, well, number one, when I'm practicing, I'm not worried about how I sound I'm practicing at home, my parents, I'm not worried what the person next door is thinking about how I play, or I hear other trumpet players playing, or they sound better than I do. That whole dynamic was gone. And so all in the lessons I was talking about, play this way, focus on the sound, focus on, things we're trying to do. And because they didn't have all that extra clutter going on, they were actually doing it. The other thing that I think made a big difference was they had no ensembles. And, everybody wants to play in ensembles at school because I want to play the big orchestra. I want to do all that. And what I find more often than not, even though I tell the students not to do it, I go, you go into rehearsals, you go into concerts, and you focus on playing the way you should be playing with the sound you want and the way you're playing. Don't, if you screw up, don't worry about it. You're in school, right? Most of the students are spending a lot of money to go to school here. I'm going, so, get your money's worth. All right. You focus on playing the right way with the right approach. Don't worry about screwing up, even if the conductor gets on you or anything else. Right. What I notice people doing is if they start playing that way and they miss it's not quite right, then they go, oh, I can't mix. I got to get this going. I got to get this out. Got to get this right. And so they get tighter and tighter trying to get all the right notes to not let people down and to get the product out there. And they end up messing up their trumpet playing. The number of students I've had come in after rehearsals who really are struggling playing the trumpet, and it's because they do at all costs, whatever the cost is, just to try to sound good and make it work. And that was gone because they had no ensembles to play in. So all of a sudden we're playing excerpts, we're playing etudes, solos, and they're playing all over, some of the best playing I've heard them do. I go, okay, now the important thing is when you come back to school and you have all those other things, you have to bring the same approach. So you don't play differently in, an orchestra rehearsal than you would be practicing in your practice room. You play the same way all the time. And don't do something, what I would say, don't play stupid just to try to get the product out. The price is too high, and that's where people really mess up their chops when they start overplaying, forcing, trying to make things work, or I've got to just play this really loud. I have students that, maybe they can play a really good fortissimo, right? And then they get an orchestra and the people around them, maybe the trombones or something, are playing an extra dynamic up. And they go, oh, I got to kind of match that or whatever else. And then they overplay and force. Of course, we know once you start doing that, you actually get even less, right? And you mess your chops up. And you go, well, that's not the way you should be playing, right? And I think that's one of the things that maybe I think, a lot of the students back in the 90s when you were in school and even the early 2000s, I think students were maybe a little less, students are always concerned about how they sound and how they do, but I think they were a little less concerned about that than they are now. There seems to be more pressure. I don't know if it comes from family. I think it probably comes from family, from society, and I think it comes internally from them.
It's kind of built
I
in
find
with
myself having, yeah, I have to, I end up spending a lot of time kind of lessons trying to talk people down. It's like, it's not that big a deal. Don't worry about it. You're going to be fine. And, what I try to tell students, that, undergrads, and I probably should maybe tell them every few weeks, but, at the start, I go, you're going to be here 4 years. 4 years is a really long time. If you focus on playing the way we're talking about playing and let it develop gradually over those 4 years, in 4 years, you're going to be playing great. And your goal is to be playing great when you leave. If you happen to play great earlier, fantastic, terrific. I mean, there's nobody's going to say, oh, it's too early for you to play great. But it's more like, if it happens earlier, great. But what you want to do is play in such a way so that the end of your time here, you're playing the best you possibly can. Instead of like, oh, I got to make this work, and you end up messing yourself up playing wise. I go, if you take that tact, the progress you'll make in those 4 years will be much less. Or if you're a master's student, it'll be much less in 2 years that you can get than what you could have, right? So the ultimate goal is for you to be playing as great as you possibly can by the time you leave, right? Not worry about, as you go along. And I tell this story, which the oldest people know, and I have to explain who he was to a lot of the younger students. But the Walter Payton story, of his last game he played for Chicago Bears, where before the game they were interviewing him, and I remember he had a white headband on, and they were interviewing him, and they were reading all the records that he had made in the NFL during his career. And he played for the Bears when they basically weren't very good, except like right at the end, right? And he had all these records. They said, "Did you ever think you would have been compared with Jim Brown, the great Cleveland running back, before, and all this?" And he looked at him with this kind of crazy look, like, "What are you talking about?" And so they put the microphone up to him. He said, "No," he said, "I never thought about any of that stuff." He said, "All I ever did was, my entire career and my entire life was work as hard as I could at my craft, what I'm doing, and see where it would take me." And he said, "If I had worked this hard and I hadn't, I'd been cut from my college team, or if I'd been cut from the NFL team, he said, I would have been fine because I gave it everything I had. I worked to the best of my abilities." He said, "That's all I ever did." He said, "This is just where I ended up." And I thought, what a great way of putting it. Once again, he wasn't so worried, "Oh, I got to do this just to be able to make the team and be able to do this." It was like, "No, I'm just going to work my hardest all the time, the way I know I should be doing it, and then see where I end up," and ended up being one of the all-time greats, right? And I think that's something that's lost. Frankly, I think it's probably lost on a lot of really young students. I think it's lost on a lot of us older guys too,
Yeah.
right? Because I still kind of feel that same way, that, I can keep improving on the trumpet, but if I try to not lose ground because I've gotten older or my practice time isn't much, then I always get myself in more trouble. If I just keep playing the way I know I should be and keep working on the things that I know I need to work on, I can keep getting better and better. At some point there'll be an end to that, no doubt, as we get older. And some people may say, "Oh, you've already passed it."
No, I don't think that's true.
Well, actually, I always tell. I'll have to mention Joey Tartell at least in at one time in this, because people that know Joey, I remember talking to him one time, talk about players that play longer than they should play, and stuff. And I go, "Yeah, I really don't want to be one of those players. I don't want to be one of those players that, plays longer than they should be playing." And he says, "Don't worry, I'll tell you when it's time." And I'm going, "Okay." So I got a safety valve there.
And he will.
And that, yeah, and he will. So, but anyway, I think that's one of the big differences. It's not like, I think this, some of the students I think now probably are in some ways the younger, really top students are maybe a little bit further along than they were 20 years ago. But I think it's a double-edged sword. I think it's also because of all this they're out there that they're exposed to. There's so much more music out there. There's so much more available information and everything else out there than there was even 20, 30 years ago when you guys were in school.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that has helped them sometimes come in a little bit higher level. But it is a double-edged sword, because I think it also then tries to get them, they're too serious and too concerned about, not failing and not ever sounding bad, right? And I think that's so. I always want people to work really hard and stay focused on the goal of what they're doing, which is making music and continuing improving on the instrument. But they need to lighten up and have more fun with it as well. If when I was about ready to quit playing the trumpet, I remember saying something to my dad because I was so frustrated. And I was about 25, 26, I think. I go, I just got to figure out, I'm not having fun playing the trumpet. And he basically said, "Well, it's not like it's always supposed to be fun, because, I mean, it is a job. You're playing all the time. And I remember saying, it's like, if it's not always going to be fun, I don't want to do it. I don't want to play it. And that was kind of the whole idea. Is like, why did I get into music? It wasn't because I'm going to make a ton of money. I've ended up doing really well, don't get me wrong, but it's like, if I want to make a ton of money, I would have gone into something else. I went into it because I loved music and I really wanted to play, and it was fun. I love playing. I mean, I have to admit, I mean, I love practicing. I just love playing the trumpet.
Yeah.
Right. It's supposed to be fun. If it's not enjoyable, then you should go do something else. No.
Well, and you do such a great job of managing. You teach so many students when things are normal, and then you're still playing a lot extra with a lot of orchestras around. How do you kind of balance that, the practice schedule? Because I know when you're younger, you're playing more, and there's like a level of confidence because you're getting your time in, and then now you don't get as much of that personal time in, probably as you did when you were younger.
I think it was, there were times in your life when our kids were younger, it was a little more challenging too, because when you have, you're taking your care of your kids as well as doing your job, which is teaching, and then also playing a lot. I mean, it's like I had a friend of mine years ago that was incredibly busy doing things. He was a lawyer and a amateur trumpet player, and he was involved in so many different things. I asked him, "How do you do that? How do you do all these things, Jim?" And he said, I've always figured if it's really important to me, I'll figure out how to make time for it. And I think that's kind of what you end up doing. I think for a number of years when the kids were younger than when my mom was really ill, um, I didn't practice a ton. I played with students and I practiced some, but I just didn't have enough. There weren't enough hours in the day, right, to literally do it. Um, the funny thing is, I probably in the past 5 years, 4 or 5 years, I'm practicing more than I have in a long time. And it's probably because I got a little bit more time to do it. The kids are older. Um, you know, I'm still teaching a lot of students and I'm doing a lot of playing. But I also realize that I can only really play my best, especially as I get older, if I'm still practicing a lot. And so I'm practicing more than I did, 10 years ago for sure, doing it. How do you balance it? It's sometimes tough. I mean, there were any number of times where, I'd teach all day and have rehearsal at night, someplace else that I'm driving to play. But there were also a lot of times where I teach all day and then go home and be kind of exhausted. And I go, I got to go down and practice tonight. And so I go down after, I'm very fortunate that in my house I can practice literally around the clock. And I go down and practice after everybody's in bed, right? I had Mike Tunnell, just trumpet teacher at University of Louisville for many years, was a really close friend. And when I remember visiting him when his kids were really young. He was at the University of Illinois at the time, and he and his wife Mimi they were playing piano and practicing trumpet, and the kids had just gone to bed. And he said, we realized early on, as soon as they come home from the hospital, start playing trumpet, and so they don't know any different.
Right.
And so as soon as our kids came home from the hospital, I started practicing trumpet. They always slept through it. My wife never bothered her and stuff. And you can hear it all over our house. I mean, I'm not always a soft trumpet player. And, and they'd never bother them. They would always sleep through it, no problem.
Yeah.
There was one point when my son was, I don't know, maybe 9 or 10, that and his bedroom was downstairs where I practice. Would come in and said, "Are you going to practice tonight?" I go, "Well, yeah, I probably will." And I was thinking it was like bothering him. He said, "Oh, good." I think it's because when he go to bed, it was like it was comforting. It felt good. He
That
was
was
in the room by
nice.
himself, but yeah, but he could hear me practicing. So I think it's the balancing. I remember talking with Bill Adam, and this is one thing that I think you have to do, which is really tough. After I'd been teaching about a year or two, I went over to Mr. Adams' house, and we were just talking and didn't really have a lesson, but we just talked a bunch. And I said, Mr. Adams, I'm having a little bit of trouble teaching all day and then going to perform at nights. And I still want to do a lot of performing, but I'm just tired. And after teaching all day and playing a lot with students. And I remember, with Adam, you always expected like, well, you just get your right in the right place. You can do anything all day long, 24 hours a day. It's not like you could do anything,
Right.
like Superman. And he said, boy, that's a tough one. He said, I really didn't perform at all most of the years I was teaching. But when I first started teaching, he said, I'd go out and perform to do stuff because I was trying to get students to the school and stuff. And he said, those are two different things. You have to separate them. And he said, when I went out and then was doing some performing, he said, I didn't teach. And I went, really interesting.
Wow.
And I went, I can't really do that because I'm performing while I'm teaching so much, continuing to do it. But I think what I ended up having to do was when I finished teaching, I had to make sure, when I'm playing with students, I'm still paying attention that I'm playing the trumpet the way I should be playing it and what my goal is. Because otherwise, I don't think I can really demonstrate what I want for the students. But I am also still focused on the student and trying to help them out. So it's not my attention is divided. When I finish teaching and I go to do my own playing, I have to wipe all that out of my head and all the other stuff and get just into performing and focus on the sound I want to play with. And what I found even earlier on when I was doing it a lot, and later on too, was that sometimes I'd be so exhausted after I finished teaching and driving. The one thing about Bloomington is any place you're gigging, you're driving at least an hour
Right.
to get to perform. Um, what I found was if I could wipe everything clear, when I first start playing, when I get there, it was really weird. And if I just forget about it all and focus on what the sound I was listening for and how I wanted to just release that sound, that by the time I'd actually play, everything was fine. Even if I'd been exhausted, it would kind of get my second win because it was like I put a different hat on. All of a sudden, now you're more the performer. Right?
And
Um,
a lot of people probably don't realize when you first started teaching at IU, you were still playing Princeton in Louisville.
Yeah, that was a really crazy time. We didn't have kids, so that was a little bit easier. Lauren would have killed me if we'd had kids and I was trying to do that.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think my first year of teaching, I had 18 students. I had a full load my first year, and that year in the orchestra, I still played 260 services with the orchestra. We actually lived in Louisville and I would just commuted back and forth.
Right.
And then the second year, I played about 200 services, and I gradually just pared it back. Now obviously I don't play with orchestras that much, and a lot of the time I did a lot of playing with Cincinnati, playing extra with them for I don't know about the last 10 years or so. Sometimes doing a lot when they were a man down in the orchestra. I ended up doing a lot of playing with them. That got pretty crazy because that was a 2 hour and 15-minute drive just to get to their hall from my house, and then coming back. And I come back literally every night, back and forth. I go back and forth, and then teach all around that. That was some pretty crazy times. And people would ask, well, why are you doing it? And number one, I love the guys in the orchestra. Really great people in the section, and not just the Liz and all the people. They're really great people in that orchestra. So I enjoyed doing it. And it was the other thing is like, hey, I've got the opportunity now. I may not have this much longer, because they're going to fill out the section at some point. Turned out they kept being a person short for a number of years, so I got a lot
Yeah.
of playing with them. But I'm going to take advantage of this because I get to play with a great orchestra, hang out with people who are really good friends now,
Yeah.
and have a great time. And it actually, I think it made my teaching better in a lot of ways, in part because sometimes the students saw me always going out and playing with a big orchestra, but also I was having fun doing it. And so then when I was teaching, it was a great balance.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's harder if you're only teaching and you're not performing. I think that's harder, right? Because you need that outlet and
Absolutely.
release. Yeah.
Did you ever, after a full day of teaching and you go to a performance, when you're in the car, were you quiet or did you listen to something to try to get your head back on straight?
Um, I think it depends. I would have to say, in recent years, I listen to less music when I'm driving than I used to. And if I do, a lot of times I'm listening to jazz, things like that, XM radio. So I do that. I listen to a lot of stuff. I actually listen to a lot of news stuff, a lot of CNN and MSNBC and things like that. I listen to the shows that are on TV. I'm just listening to the audio versions of them.
Right.
And that kind of, once again, that kind of gets me out of, if I'm focused on music all the time and I'm listening to music and all that, and then I go to play music, it's like, it's too much of an overload. I
Right.
never, I never knew when I lived in Nashville in my early 20s, um, I remember I was listening. I had a great stereo in my car all the time, and anytime I was driving any place, I was listening to great stuff. And there was an older guy, it was a Dixieland jazz trumpet player, really fine player, And I was talking to him. I says, "Oh man, I don't listen to music. I'm playing all the time. I don't listen to music anymore." I was like, "Man, how do you? I don't understand. That makes no sense. That makes no sense." And then I realized about 20 years later, I go, I'm listening to less than I used to listen. And in part because I was playing a lot, I was teaching a lot, I had family and everything else. I didn't have time to listen that much to things. And a lot of times I wanted to do something that was different. I didn't want to be doing the same thing and focusing on that. There would be times that, I'd be driving and I go, I want to listen to this piece and imagine my part while I'm driving, because usually when that happens, when I didn't feel as comfortable with the piece as I would like, right?
Hmm.
Because
Hmm.
I hadn't spent as much time really getting to know the piece as I would have liked. And so I would listen to it to kind of help supplement that.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And I know we've been going a while, so I wanted to ask you before you get off here. I think you're probably more of a Zen like teacher than a lot of people. I mean, you've read a lot of books, you recommend a lot of things.
Uh-huh.
Maybe a little more philosophical than analytical about a lot of stuff. You've talked a lot about. I just want to go over some books that you always recommend and maybe why you like those books, like Golf is Not a Game of Perfect, Inner Game of
Mm-hmm.
Tennis. I'm sure there's a couple others. Those are the ones that come to mind. Maybe Zen and
Sure.
the Art of Archery or something.
Yeah, they're all great books. I mean, obviously, Bill Adam always used to talk about psychocybernetics, which is a great book. That was one of the first books he had me read. That, along with the Inner Game of Tennis. The interesting thing, I remember Adam recommending the Inner Game of Tennis, and I kind of remember reading it, but I think it was probably another 10 years later before or when I reread it again. It maybe been that many years that all of a sudden it just hit me how great a book it was. You know, Before when I first read it, it was like, yeah, okay, I understand it, but I was like more just getting, it was trumpet playing, right? I make no bones about it. I'm going, I think the best book on ever written on playing the trumpet is the Inner Game of Tennis, right? Because, and I have it, I tell my students, I go, I have it on my phone, right? And when I find myself getting caught up in the how-tos of what I'm doing and focusing on even the positive things that I should be doing, I'm focusing on the mechanical, right? Instead of the goal. Then any number of times before concerts, when I find my head in the wrong place, I open that book and I just start going through chapters and reading some of the things he's talking about. I'm going, oh yes, right. We don't focus on the mechanics. You focus on the goal, and then your body figures out how to do that, which is exactly what Bill Adam always taught. That's what Vince Chikowitz was talking about as well. And that book is to me is still incredible about how our mind and body works. And the playing tennis is no different than playing the trumpet from that aspect. It's I heard for so many years that playing the trumpet was mostly mental, right? But I never really understood for a long time how absolutely true that is, but understanding what part of the mind you're using, right? And it's always got to be the creative part of the mind. I know I got to know Will Scarlett, a number of years ago, in part because you recommended, something you told me, and I decided to go play for him before an audition. And I still remember vividly one time we were talking about things, and he said, John, you have to remember even the focusing on the most positive technical thing is still a negative because it takes your focus off the music. And I
Right.
went, in a nutshell, that's basically it. Most natural players that we consider naturals, from the start, they can do all these things. They never were focused on how to do things as much. They were copying maybe a teacher or somebody they were listening to. They played the instrument and they just kind of learned to play the instrument by listening to that person. They weren't focused on how to do stuff. And everybody, oh, they're natural and how everything came together. It's like, well, their mind was just focused in the right place from the start. Whether because they had a great teacher that helped them along that way, or if they had no teacher, right? And all they did was listen, right? I remember Vince DiMartino telling me, yeah, I didn't have a teacher really until I went to Eastman. He said, all I did was, he said, I listened to everybody play, and he said, I went and watched them. So he'd watch them, and he listened to them, and he just kind of figured it out, right? You know,
Yeah.
I played for years. My students have heard about him. got to work with him not too long ago. A great lead player all the time. I was down in Nashville, named Mike Haynes, and this guy was one of the best lead players I've ever heard. He could play Maynard solos that were just unbelievable. Double high C that was just riveting. Incredibly exciting sound. You know, if you looked at him play, you'd say he's playing all wrong. All right. But, you know, the way he learned to play was his seventh grade band director, I think, handed him a stack of Maynard albums and said, play like this. And so it was like, okay. So he just got into listening to that sound, and he developed a way that worked for him. And, you know, I worked in the studios with him for almost 10 years, and it was just incredible, some of the stuff I heard him play. All right. And, you know, just amazing. And he never had a teacher. He never really had a teacher. The only time he had a teacher, I think a fortunate thing was, you know, there were some things he did unconventionally that would you never recommend a student to do playing wise, but worked for him. And probably the best thing his teacher did was he didn't change it.
Yeah.
He didn't, you know, he said, hold it, you're doing that all wrong. You know, and we've heard stories about people, you know, hey, I could really do all this and stuff. And then somebody told me I'm doing it all wrong. And I fixed all that. And now I can't do any of that.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, and, you know, so, you know, I think the idea is so much, and I have to kind of remind myself to get back to this in my own teaching as well as my own playing, is I have to start focusing and keep my head always focused on sound, right? And it's not just sound, it's the sound of the instrument I'm playing in the phrase that I'm playing. So it's not like, you know, my basic sound should stay the same as I move all over the instrument, but the phrase will have shape to it. So my goal is to play with a great sound within the sense of the phrase that I'm playing. And that's where I need to be focused all the time when I'm playing and when I'm practicing. And it's actually what I should be doing with my teaching. I have to admit, you know, I don't feel like I'm a very good teacher a lot of the time. And one of the reasons, you know, I think sometimes I get to, how should I say, off base with my students. I don't get them focused as much on sound and phrasing as I should. And sometimes it's because I'm trying to correct them just getting airflow going and stuff like that. And it gets them thinking too much about mechanics and trying to do it. And I'm going, no, it's a concept. It's kind of you play like this. All right. That's that whole thing is like, you know, I got a general idea of how I produce the sound, but I have a specific idea, an exact idea of how I want it to sound. And we have to keep always bringing that to the fore in our practice, in our playing, in our teaching. And I go, you know, there's too many times when I get off on that in my playing and in my teaching. So I'll apologize to all my students,
Oh,
you know,
please.
that I've had over the years when I've gotten a little bit too off that way and haven't gotten them to use their ears better and focus on the sound they want. You know, I think that when that lesson I had with Bill Adam, he said, you know, if you know exactly how you want the sound, that's what you have to focus on. Well, the other aspect of that is not only knowing the goal sound you want, but it's having the ears to hear it, right? So you have to develop your ears so you can hear that quality of sound, and if you're keeping it the way you want in the shape of the phrase.
Right.
Okay? But I think, you know, there are an awful lot of people too that play with the exact same sound on every note, and they don't play musically at all.
Yeah.
Well, they're great technicians on the trumpet. They can play all over the trumpet, and maybe they can play loud, high, and do all these things like that. But if there's not great musical shape and phrasing to what you're doing, you've missed the point. Right. So it's play with that great sound, keep that sound the same within the shape of the phrase. It's not just keep the sound the same, because then it'll just be this kind of flat line phrase you're playing. It's like keep the sound the same within the shape of the phrase, and the shape of the phrase changes. You have to follow the shape of the phrase, and if you're zeroed in on that sound, then your body starts figuring out how to actually do that.
Yeah. I remember you and I were talking about, because you know, at least when I was in school, it was before Joey was there, and you had a lot of guys in David Baker's band and Dominic's band studying with you, and it didn't make any difference because the concept was the same, playing the trumpet was the same. But I remember you mentioning something like that you thought jazz players sometimes had an advantage because there was so much orally that they were thinking about versus what as an orchestral player we were thinking about, you know, with that.
Well, I think there's a couple things. I think jazz players, if they're good young jazz players, number one, most of them have much better ears than classical trumpet players, right? Because they use their ears a lot more. They have to hear the harmonic changes. They hear much more colors, right? I remember a good friend of mine was a New York player for many, many years. I lost touch with him, but I remember him talking about in theory. He was a few years older than I, but he was talking about in theory. He said, I never missed a harmonic dictation. Well, he grew up with Jamie Aebersold in his neighborhood, right? He and Pat Harbison. And he said, I never miss harmonic dictation because every chord, every inversion has a different color to the sound. Everyone sounds different. So he said, as long as I know what tonic is, I said, I never miss, what it was. And he said, because they all had a different color. A lot of jazz players develop that kind of concept to their ears. And I think that can be an advantage, whereas classical players, one of the problems with classical music is we're so caught up what's on the page that we're trying to play the notes on the page. Number one, you see the ups and downs all over, and you see the fast notes and everything else. And that really jades your focus on when you're playing. If you were just playing from memory, you wouldn't even know you were playing some of the really hard things, right? So I mean, we get caught so much in the visual side. Jazz players tend to be more focused on the aural side, right? I think our job is, as musicians playing the music that we see that's in front of us on the page, is we have to be playing the music that we hear, not the music that we see. And that's the aspect. If you're singing what's on the page and you're singing the music that you want, that's what you should be doing. But what I find so many people doing, myself included, is reading the notes on the page and then hoping they sound great instead of singing the notes on the page with the great sound, and that develops your ears and your concept of sound.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
For sure.
and that's your ears are your best tool in becoming a better trumpet player, not your mind. All right, get your mind out of it. That's the whole thing. Keep your conscious mind out of it. But what you want to do is you want to develop your ears and use your ears. They'll never fail you if you're listening. Every time I've been trying to fix something in my trumpet playing, it's not quite right. When I start listening more closely and I don't hear the sound I want to play with, and I start focusing on that sound, everything starts falling into place.
That's it. You always keep it really simple.
All right.
Hey,
Well, try. Uh-huh.
before you go, let me tell you who's on here. Justin Smith's on here.
Oh, wow.
Catherine Cosgrove wants to say hi. Carol says hello.
Yeah. Hi, Carol. That's the picture I saw. Of course, it's Carol.
Yeah.
I assume Thaddeus is around someplace too.
I don't know. He's. I don't see him on here, but they could be watching on Facebook or anything like that. So, but thank you for doing this.
Oh, it's great. It's great fun. It's great
fun. And hopefully I'll get to see you in person as opposed to this.
Right.
This.
I hope we all get to see each other in person and get to play again. I'm very worried about orchestras in this country and the arts, because obviously a lot of them are really struggling or have shut down, and it's going to be really tough getting back. It's going to be really tough.
I know you have a lot of friends in Nashville, and of course that situation is probably worse than anywhere else. And Indianapolis is pretty bad too. But
it's worse. It's worse now. My fear is that there'll be more like it in the near future. It's just they may be more realistic at this point and saying this is what's going to happen. It's pretty depressing because there's a chance they may not come back or be anywhere close to where they were. I would hope that maybe when things get a little bit better, the funds will come in and they come back and get the players back. I think a lot of orchestras are going to be struggling with that. They've just actually been more upfront about it, I think, in some ways.
Yeah.
And the other fear I have is that we hope will change. It's the out of sight, out of mind. People get used not to going to concerts. Then all of a sudden the concerts start up. Will they come back? My hope is everyone will miss it and people will realize how important it is, and the crowds will be in support will be better than ever. But I have a little bit of a fear that out of sight, out of mind, people are like, oh, we don't really need to do that or spend the money on that. And then it hurts the arts even more. So I hope I'm wrong about that. And it's got the musicians of the future. It's going to be a real challenge for people to come out of this. And, you know, it always was anyway, but
Yeah.
to spark the interest and get people really interested in what we're doing and back in the concert halls again.
I think there's a little
And
bit of,
hope, you know,
well, I hope you're right. I mean, I think there's some fatigue setting in, right? Because, well, you're not on social media, which is probably why you've kept your sanity and your way of being
yeah.
for so long. By the way, that was Thaddeus that said hello, by the way.
Okay, yeah.
But you know, like I see when this first happened, you saw a ton of people putting stuff on social media, playing, and
Hmm.
some orchestras have done some of that. But I do see
Right,
some lulls, and I think there's some fatigue with it. Or what's the point in
right.
practicing? And you know,
Well,
and
it's also, you know, while it's good to do that, it's not easy to do that,
right,
right? It's not, you know, that takes putting stuff together. I mean, some of the things that people have put together. I mean, my students did a really this year did an incredible thing. Bethany Vaughn was the person who put it together and did it, but they did a happy birthday thing for me because my birthday was when we were out of school and literally had everybody playing different parts of a happy birthday arrangement in different languages. She put the whole thing together, and
wow,
it's a really great video. I mean, I was blown away. And she learned a lot, but she spent a ton of time and hours doing that. It's not easy to do. I mean, of course, anything else, the more you do it, the easier it gets. But I was like really impressed. But it takes a lot of energy to do.
that really outpaces the happy birthday that we did for you when I was,
That's right.
which
Yeah.
was in the parking lot, and you were in this corner office. You remember this? And
Yeah. Yeah.
I think Justin was in on this. There were like five of us, and we all played Happy Birthday a half step apart.
Yeah. I
And
remember that.
or maybe Justin was in the class. If he remembers, he can text me. But that David Baker was downstairs in one of the classrooms and said, "What the hell is going?"
Yeah. I just thought you guys were playing out of tune.
That was well. That would be an easy assumption.
Yeah. No, it was pretty amazing, you know, because it had so many different blocks going in and out. I mean, it was, you know, the technology of what people are doing. That's been a really cool part of the inventive side of things is to
Yeah,
see some of that happening. But it's tough to maintain, and it's still you're not interacting with people.
right.
And you know, this is not a solitary art form. You
No,
know, it can only go so far. You need to have other people around you that you're playing with, and hopefully we'll do that sooner than later. If we can get government and people being smarter, it'll happen sooner rather than later. If that doesn't happen, it'll be much later.
right.
You know, but we need that, you know, to get things going back where they should be in the arts and teaching. I mean, it's, you know, I enjoyed getting together and teaching my students, you know, when I was doing it online with them, but it wasn't nearly as much fun as when they were walking in this, you know, in the studio and you're hanging out with them one on one. You're talking about stuff and hearing them play live. I mean, that's what it's all about.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll cross our fingers and wear a mask.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Wear the masks. Wear the masks.
That's right.
All
So,
right.
all right. Thank you so much.
Sure.
It's great to
Thanks,
see
Mark.
you.
Thanks for everybody. Yeah, it's great to see you. Take care.
Take care. Take care. Bye
All right.
bye.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye.